Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happenstance in this Truth Bomb Riff. My name is Patrick Lovell. I'm the producer with a $71 trillion truth that basically parts the clouds and, kicks, I don't know, the door down on the darkness to usher in the light, to be able to fully extrapolate all of the madness that we're in the midst of, which comes at us fast and furious in every single direction. And in this sort of new, I don't know, initiative, let's just call it an experiment. I'm on chapter three, and I'm recording this on Wednesday, February 11th, 2026 at, let's say it's 8 a.m. my time. And, I'm just like I do every morning. As I get my day started doing 50 million other things, I basically try to immerse myself into what's happening, try to fully understand the trajectory of the day, where it's going, how things are rolling out, and then ultimately how the information I have, which is the $71 trillion truth, fits in a way that nobody can see the forest for the trees. And it just is incredible because there is such an appetite and outrage. There's an appetite for truth and an outrage against lies that we're being, a lot of people like to call it being gaslit. A lot of people like to bandy about terms like narcissism or sociopathy and all of these other types of things to describe, I think, justifiably, the idiot in chief who has completely lost his frickin' mind, and we should have invoked the 25th Amendment long ago. But the nature of the cabinet, the liars, the reaction to the lies, the strategy to flood the zone, the information that's coming out in the Epstein files, and all of the other things as it parlays to the information I'm providing you. In the first chapter, I said, here's an overview of what the $71 trillion truth is and an introduction to the Clean New Deal. In the second chapter, I believe I just simply reacted to the information that really is top of mind to me, that in the midst of all this madness, in terms of really the thing that affects all of us, the Trump administration, Trump effectively, and all of those that are involved with the tapestry of the billionaire apparatus that created Project 2025, has waged war on renewable energy. And the New York Times declared yesterday, kind of reminded me of the Elton John song, the war is declared, and God is dead and the war is declared, or the war has begun, something to that effect. Leave On was the song. Anyway, it kind of sounded like that yesterday when they had proclaimed, meaning the New York Times, that all environmental regulation is effectively dead, and these guys have won. And then they pin out the nature of 16 people involved with what became Heritage Foundation and Russell Vote and the Project 2025, and how it parlays into all of these things that lend itself to massive corruption and grift by the Trump administration via crypto and petro states and billions of dollars that have been looted on top of the Epstein files. Okay. So, a couple of things that I think are worthy of at least kind of dipping our toe into and then fully extrapolating it to the information I'm sharing. And what we're doing is to understand that I think the first thing I want to tap into is Mike Figueredo of the Humanist Report did a really nice feature this morning, which is kind of creating continuity of a lot of information that's already been out there, really nothing new, but in terms of his reaction to it and how it builds into his formula and algorithms and all of the other things. But he lays out some important information that I think is worthy of us to kind of sink our teeth into to kind of get further perspective. So let's just take a quick look at a few things here.
Government is engaged in an active cover-up of the largest sex trafficking scandal and influence peddling scandal in the history of the United States, and Donald Trump is right at the center of it.
And we saw Jamie Raskin mention that Donald Trump has been mentioned in the Epstein files over 1 million times, to something to that degree. But Mike goes on to kind of pick up that and make the case on some of the redacted files and more information and introspection and all of the other things. But that initial statement that this is the largest sex trafficking ring and cover up in American history. Okay. It is enormous, and it seems to be getting more. More information comes out every single day. And, I talked yesterday about the Epstein files writ large, about somebody on the inside who knew this stuff. Obviously, who wanted the information out there had the courage to stay in there and get the information out, or it's pure incompetence. It could be either one of the Justice Department, right? But in either case, all of this information is coming out that furthers what I continue to tell you every single day. They're all lying to us, okay? Who's they? The entirety of government, the entirety of media, the entirety of what this whole cabal of this sinking, rotting ship of manifestation of, diabolical betrayal and deception. But it's been at work now for a very long time. And so let's pick up later on in this particular podcast and see further what Mike reveals.
Issue that needs to be addressed.
So it's starting to make more sense to me why Dan Bongino wanted to ditch the FBI as soon as possible, because he didn't want to be there when the entire house of cards came tumbling down. Sure, Pam Bondi also lied, but Kash Patel, perhaps more than anyone else, bent over backwards to protect the elites that were implicated in the Epstein files. And again, we still haven't even seen the rest of the Epstein files yet. Most of them we have not seen, but aside from Massey and Khanna, other lawmakers did see them, and their immediate reactions were very telling. Like, you would think that they saw a ghost.
I just wanted to ask you, have you had a chance to review any of the unredacted files over at the DOJ, the Epstein files?
I did.
You did?
Yeah, I just came from there.
What can you tell us?
There's a bunch of sick fucks.
Well, initially, my reaction to all this was, I don't care. I don't know what the big deal is. But now I see what the big deal is.
Any reaction on what you've seen so far?
I think that there's folks who are definitely implicated and co-conspirators. And, I don't think everyone there that was talking about underage girls being trafficked are victims.
Got it. And do you support any clemency for Ghislaine Maxwell? She was saying that she was...
I do not.
Okay.
I think Ghislaine Maxwell should get more time, and she should definitely be in a harsher prison than what she's in. It's absolutely disgusting.
My God. Listen, we have a right to know what they saw. Nonetheless, I'm afraid of what we're all going to see, because there's so much more that we still don't know, and we already know quite a bit. In that last batch, there was talk of bodies being buried. There was talk of torture. There was admissions of pedophilia, pretty explicitly so. And there was talk of how to get rid of poor people as a whole with Bill Gates, as well as discussions between Epstein and Peter Thiel about how they basically benefit from the collapse of civilization, not to mention a conversation about how foreign intervention is an effective distraction from domestic strife. And we're still learning more from that batch. Epstein was also asked who the gynecologist was that he sends his victims to, which is just so nauseating. He also engaged in blackmail and was almost certainly an intelligence asset for Israel and possibly other governments. And aside from Trump, more members of his regime were recently exposed in that last batch of files, including Elon Musk and also Howard Lutnick, who seemed genuinely anxious, might I add, when he was forced to admit that he was caught lying.
I think you understand the root of concern here. It's the way you described very emphatically your first encounter with him in his apartment, said you were disgusted, would never have any contact with him again.
I say to him, massage table in the middle of your house? How often do you have a massage? And he says, every day. And then he gets weirdly close to me. Oh. And he says, and the right kind of massage. Mm. Now, my wife is standing here. So she looks at me and I look at her and we say, I'm sorry, we have to go. And we left. And in the 6 or 8 steps it takes to get from his house to my house, my wife and I decided that I will never be in the room with that disgusting person ever again.
Did you, in fact, make the visit to Jeffrey Epstein's private island?
I did have lunch with him as I was on a boat going across on a family vacation. My wife was with me, as were my 4 children and nannies. I had another couple they were there as well with their children, and we had lunch on the island. That is true, for an hour, and we left with all of my children, with my nannies and my wife all together. We were on family vacation. We were not apart. To suggest there was anything untoward about that in 2012, I don't recall why we did it, but.
So he claims that when he was neighbors with Epstein, all it took was one visit to his house to realize, oh, this guy's a gigantic creep. But behind the scenes, he was chumming it up with him. He was emailing Epstein plans to go to his island and oddly listing the ages of his children, which is a chilling email to read. So he got caught red-handed, and Senator Merkley pointed out how you can hear in his voice how nervous he was.
And I can hear the angst in your voice over the Epstein files.
And you could hear that same angst in Trump's voice whenever he talks about the Epstein files, or at least that was the case. Now he's just angry whenever it comes up for obvious reasons, but he was always very coy and squirrely whenever Epstein's name was brought up, and, automatically felt the need to defend himself. And I just feel like they all have the same demeanor, and it's the demeanor that tells you that they're guilty without telling you they're guilty, if you know what I mean. But I don't know why any of them are nervous in the first place, because even though the criminality that has been uncovered in the Epstein files is bringing down elites throughout the world, there still hasn't been any real accountability here in the United States. And Roe kind of made this point.
This is bringing down the British government, and they bring down the British monarchy. It's bringing down countries and the elites across the country. What are we doing here in the United States to stand up to the Epstein class? I mean, we've got a commerce secretary who's all over the Epstein files. Where's the outrage? Where's the outrage at the billionaires in Silicon Valley, in finance, in Hollywood? They're going to Epstein's island. We need moral accountability in the United States, just like they're having in so many other countries around the world.
So, look, that is really the most important thing to consider, and why I am doing what I'm doing. Okay, so first of all, kudos to everybody who's now circling the wagons over something that took place over 20 years ago. Okay. I mean, I can't tell you, as the producer of my work, how many times I had run into gatekeepers or people that are, let's say, influencers in media that pretend to think they know what's going on. And they would say sometimes about the story that I illuminate that provides you this pathway to the $71 trillion truth that I'm, trying to get tens of millions of you to understand, that provides all of the information, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment, of who did what, when, and how, but ultimately what we're in the midst of. And, and I use this as a point. They used to say, well, that happened a long time ago, or that's like ancient history, this, that, and the other. But meanwhile, everything that we're in the midst of with Epstein and these revelations that have completely taken over really everything, especially the way the algorithm works and why everybody is spending so much time on these efforts. One, it's interesting. Two, it's incredibly illuminating and revealing. But I'll tell you, from where I'm sitting, as large as it is, as huge as it is, as revolting and ridiculous it is, it's the tip of the freaking iceberg. And yet it reiterates and validates what I've been saying the whole time. They're all liars. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I see Howard Lutnick's face and I see that worm, that I want to use just the most derogatory, descriptions of who he is, because he just represents to me the most god-awful aspects of what has transpired into this country, and which revealed all over the Epstein files. They just lie. And when you look at the entire cabinet of these idiots of this Trump administration, the formula is lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate, act as if this is some sort of reality television show. Well, meanwhile, it's so absurd. It's like satire on top of reality, but people can't quite, make heads or tails of it until, we see things like, for example, Renee Nicole Good and Alex Preddy literally murdered, and this entire administration gaslight us, even though we've got, evidence, to the ends of the earth and back to tell us exactly what we saw. And then they're just like all over the airwaves with all of these machinations of these echo chambers and these propaganda outlets that have been in business for now several decades, starting with Fox Media, in every way, in every aspect of how they operate, basically to try to, gaslight is the terminology, but it's just so ridiculously obvious. And then on top of all of that stuff, when you hear Trump talk about, briefly, and I've seen a couple of interviews recently, regarding whether or not Epstein had committed suicide, it's like, if they're going to lie to our face about Alex Preddy and Renee Nicole Good, based on everything we've saw, What do you think they do about something we didn't see, given all of the other things we know about, the ridiculous nature of what was happening in that particular prison cell and missing, footage and so on and so forth, which is just obvious, right? But at the same time, it's like, okay, what if he's got everything to lose, right? And I'm talking about Trump and everything he's surrounded by, right? But again, to reiterate the point, everybody's talking about something that happened 2 decades ago. It was really 3 decades in the making, okay? And ultimately, now we're like, eureka, there's a billionaire class, which many people are calling the Epstein class, that is above the law. They can rape with impunity girls. What else might they be up to? Well, that's the $71 trillion truth. So basically, you need to understand, again, I'm a producer. I'm a producer that probably everybody in the world should know, but we got quashed. And I'm pretty sure we got quashed by BlackRock, the most powerful company in the world. And if you ever want to care to endeavor that, I've got many truth bombs on that, but I also have, I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to engage that, because this is how huge the situation is. So hopefully I'm sharing my screen. I am. So let's go to, I'm going to show you not trailers, but the posters of my work. So I'll show you the poster of my work first, and then I'll just make this case. So after the 2008 great financial crisis, my life was in turmoil for a long time. I've told the story a million times. It's all over social media. It's actually all over online if you want to do a Google search on who I am. Again, Patrick Lovell. I think pretty much Google calls me the director, even though I'm a producer. That's what I do more than anything else, and I am the producer. But my first film was Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream. And incidentally, 13 is a big number in my life, and I'm in the 13th year of this odyssey trying to get this information out there. But it began for me after the 2008 great financial crisis. It took me a number of years to kind of, wade through and survive and get to a point where I could actually get this film made. And I went out with my colleague, Eric Vaughn, and we just basically surfed the Occupy Wall Street movement to get our first foray into asking the right questions, which was really trying to discover what was obviously hidden, that destroyed the country and was in this, in the aftermath of the great financial crisis. And the way we put it all together was ultimately, look, there's this cabal of, interest networks that basically revolve around the military industrial complex, the financial, let's call it the fossil fuel. It's like this. It's the military industrial fossil fuel financial paradigm. That's who's in control. And all of the boards of directors of big companies like Goldman Sachs sit on Exxon and so on and so forth, or, some sort of military industrial deal, Lockheed. They're all interchangeable, right? And they're all basically the expression of government's power, or the United States' superpower, right? Now, behind that, as we're beginning to see, all of these manifestations of Epstein were, working, before 9/11. 9/11 is a huge part of this. The war on terror is a huge part of this, and so on and so forth. But we put those pieces of the puzzle together to show you that we're not a democracy, and that there's a cabal of, quite frankly, billionaires behind the scenes that are above the law. And what ultimately we endeavored was, how does that system exist? Well, it exists based on the fossil fuel paradigm and the military industrial paradigm. And I've since gone on to learn so much more about, the nature of the dollar reserve currency being the global reserve currency, I should say, and what that means in all things. And I don't want to, try to lecture on that at the moment. But look, if you don't know, the Trump administration is the very expression of what we put here on our poster, America for Sale. That's what the Trump administration is doing. And so I made this film. We distributed it 13 years ago. And if you watch it now, and in fact, I'll put a link, and it's a free link in the description below. And if you watch this film, you're going to think what's going on. What happened 13 years ago is happening now. Because all of this is the same story. It's all a continuation, in media and government and the law, all basically collapsed around the corruption that I've been punching holes through to get to my next project, which was a 5-part series that we produced called The Con. And as you can see here on the poster, the bold declaration that we were all sold a lie, the truth behind the largest criminal conspiracy in American history. So as that representative said, at the beginning of Epstein, this is the largest cover-up of the largest sex trafficking scheme in history, which is probably accurate and probably true. Believe it or not, it's the tip of the iceberg of what I just laid out here. And quite frankly, and I say metaphorically, I shouldn't use the term, but let's just say there's a lot of similarities in terms of predation, and particularly predatory capitalism based on this monopoly that I'm telling you, that ultimately leads you to the $71 trillion truth, which is the guarantee, the sure thing, the thing that this entire cabal feeds on, okay? That it lets them be above the law and ultimately, beyond accountability, okay, which means that you live in an autocratic state or a corporate fascist state is the way I describe it, and everything is a myth. And then everybody understands and reconciles exactly what I'm talking about with these details, you can't break the system. As I say frequently, this is the black box of truth that undergirds the entirety of our corrupt revolving door system. And I created the Clean New Deal to basically remedy this whole thing, because the Democrats don't have answers, okay? They're all reacting. And there's good Democrats, don't get me wrong. And I'm progressive and I am, traditionally Democratic. We could talk about my ideology all day long, but at the center of everything that I'm about is integrity and the rule of law. Now, I love competition and entrepreneurship as well, and I believe the country is large enough to have social safety nets, and we could be the superpower, but we're basically fast becoming a third world, a ridiculous freaking failed state, right? In fact, as demonstrated by what Mike was saying earlier, yeah, European countries are now holding their bad actors accountable, and it might take down literal governments like Keir Starmer in Britain. And as I mentioned that the other day. So that should give you kind of an overview understanding of who I am, and what I do. But I've got to show you this. It's like Groundhog Day. As many people as I've already reached, I need to reach tens of millions of people because this work got quashed. But as we're talking about victims in the Epstein files and young girls that were sucked into this predatory trap because maybe they were from, little means, and they had big dreams, and, they were promised this, that, and the other to play ball, to basically be, entrapped in a rape scenario, right? Or a sexual trafficking ring, to get people, what we all know Epstein was all about, blackmail, right? Get powerful people involved, get stuff on them, and then you can leverage them. Okay. I think we can all recognize that is the case, but I want you to understand where we came from the con, because all of media obfuscated, hid, denied, lied, and did everything that they've been doing for the last 14 years to hide this information that we had to go on this mammoth adventure to be able to understand, okay, and put all the pieces of the puzzle together. And that's what we do as producers and filmmakers and people who have the capacity to know how to do these types of things. But I think this demonstrates, and I apologize, you can't hear the music in the background, unfortunately. So I would encourage you to go look for the con trailer online so you can get the full scope of this. But this is just the trailer of season 1. So take a look at this.
I mean, it was just 2008, 2010, where there were entire streets that had foreclosure signs.
You had millions of people asking for help on their loans to companies that had no interest in helping them.
We were being lied to. City mortgage employees continually lied to us over the phone. When I asked them specific questions, they would never answer the questions.
My husband had a spinal cord injury, rendering him paralyzed. So Wells Fargo offered us a loan modification. They didn't return phone calls. They provided me misinformation. People were being paid to lie to us, paid to disappear, and they never had any intention of helping us.
Several employees from Bank of America were given Target and Best Buy gift cards for foreclosing on homeowners.
These were just document mills that would just sign any piece of paper that was necessary in order to convince a judge to let him take the house.
All of the documents that were signed by these robots, they sit behind me. It's 39,000. They were all fraudulent. These banks, they were a front. They were a front for criminal enterprise.
Our whole regulatory system was a failure when it came to this issue.
Jury was kept from seeing my aunt's exculpatory evidence. The evidence that was pro Barbara got shut out.
I heard from a former Chief Justice, you know that the outcome is dependent upon where the judge believes he's been placed in the revenue stream. Who does him the biggest financial favors? So in other words, you're saying that they're bought off.
At the time that I was running, I challenged my opponent not to take money from any banks that got government bailout money. And I did get a call from Washington telling me to be careful because there were a lot of people who got that money who were in my party.
Where people can get away with stuff, they will. And the best place to get away with stuff is have a big corporation that's traded on the stock exchange that gives a lot of money to lobbyists and politicians and make it so complicated that nobody can ever figure out what the fuck you did. And you win.
There is an alarm to be sounded in the aftermath of 2008. It is when you have too much wealth in too few hands, the rule of law begins to collapse.
All the Americans who are still out of work, got low wages, huge student debts, underwater homes. All these problems are a direct result of the financial crash.
The failure to rescue the American working and middle class in the Great Recession, that has set us on the trajectory to where we find ourselves today.
It's a fight between Main Street and Wall Street, between big banks and real people.
I'm not supposed to win. Borrower is not supposed to win. That is this game. Is if you've got the money, you can make them all, or you can buy them all.
No individual faced any accountability for any of this.
I have a new definition for the perfect crime. Perfect crime is a crime that involves everyone.
Do you know what the American people would do if those leaders of those banks were indicted? It would send a message loud and clear that the game's over. And we let them off the hook. We let them off the hook.
The only way it's going to change is the same way it was affected, which was millions of people have finally fucking had it.
Yeah, well, it's so funny. I accidentally played season 2, and we have all of that information on the shelf, and it's unbelievable the information we have. But I also have a podcast that we did called the New Untouchables, the Pecora Files, which I believe has 21 episodes, where we were able to put a lot of the whistleblowers and the expert witnesses and so on and so forth that reveal this. But I guess it was probably a good thing that I showed that first, to be honest with you, because I want to make the point that when I think you saw first and foremost that there were a lot of women that were contextually targeted and predated upon. Okay, ring a bell with Epstein, but of course there were older women, there were women with families, so on and so forth. But what's really probably the most important thing to really both men and women, more so women, quite frankly, is shelter, safety, security, your home, right? And they were all set up on these liar's loans to where they got set up, they got rug pulled, they basically had their lives turned upside down and destroyed. The carnage was absolutely insane. And it was involved with a $4.5 trillion housing bubble that became a $900 trillion global calamity. That the $71 trillion truth that I'm trying to reveal to you is the bridge or the Band-Aid or the thing that is created the world we live in, because tens of millions of people got targeted, set up, destroyed, and it led to tens of millions of more that weren't in the housing crisis, that were pensioners or people that lived in cities. It just, nobody could escape this. And by the way, they started off predating on minorities, which I'll show you in my first trailer. But again, this is all information that is on the shelf. Now, I think more importantly, the continuity that you saw in there with documentation fabrication. There were literally tens of millions of felonies involved with this sort of fraud. And by the way, Donald Trump has been involved with documentation fabrication his entire career. Everything that is involved with his taxes, involved with his, what happened in Letitia James' civil fraud case, where he supposedly defrauded the bank ultimately, which the bank was involved with, but that's another story. And but he's always projecting, right? Have you ever heard the fact that every accusation is what's the word I'm looking for? Is basically admittance of guilt, right? Because that's the lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate scenario. But these are the tactics and the techniques that these criminals have been using in these particular apparatuses, be it finance and lending and real estate and all of these types of things for now decades. But I want to go back to the original trailer, which I meant to play first. So this is the series trailer of our work, and this was available, and I'll explain it to you. But this is a completed 6-part series. So this is the trailer to the con, and my apologies for those who have already seen it. But It never gets old considering what we're in the midst of.
I'm neither an economist or a scholar. I'm just an average American who lost my home and very nearly my family to foreclosure when the market imploded. And I've spent almost every day since trying to find out why. Once the dust settled, it quickly became clear that my story was no different than millions of other Americans. We all thought that we were alone. We all thought that we'd failed. But none of us really knew why.
With a gun in her hand, Polk apparently shot herself in the chest as deputies were knocking on her door with eviction papers in hand.
Dramatic increase in mortgage fraud cases was the canary in the mine. It was the warning.
This was money chasing people. This was not somebody looking for a loan.
It was all designed to maximize profits for all of the different players.
The person who sold you a loan made more money if they sold you a higher rate loan.
They were sold a lot.
They're selling to their very clients these loans that they know are a disaster.
I lost my home, not because of money, because of fraud.
I don't believe Addie Polk took out the mortgage on her home. I don't believe she signed any documents.
They just generated all this junk, took home huge bonuses, and then when it collapsed, they said, oh, not us.
This notion that the financial crisis was there wasn't fraud and there wasn't crime is absolutely wrong. It's dead.
They were targeting, in many cases, minorities.
We were waiting for the leadership to say, go. That never happened.
The investigation was suppressed.
This was all part of the same puzzle that was falling apart.
This is the largest conspiracy of lies in the history of the world.
This investigation has just begun.
So, yeah, hopefully that, got your attention. At least both of those got your attention. I think I'm going to stop share for a moment to make this point, and then I'll circle back to the Clean New Deal. But so, I wanted to do this in 10 minutes, and it's really an impossibility. But hopefully you're still in tune. And I think this is the 748th Truth Bomb riff that I've done, in addition to the 19 hours that's on, the Pecora Files, which is a podcast, which is fantastic. The new Untouchables, I apologize, the Pecora Files. But again, you got to understand what I've been trying to lay out here, right? Yesterday, I demonstrated how Donald Trump's administration has effectively achieved what it had set out to do on behalf of the billionaire class. That is basically this permutation of the financial fossil fuel military industrial juggernaut that is also deeply involved with intelligence, of course, to destroy the progress for renewable energies and completely adapt the paradigm given all of the science and what we know, right? This nauseating scenario with this effort by the MAGA zombie apocalypse, by the billionaires, was to basically utilize lies and overwhelming lies to befuddle idiots and then make, really simple sort of juxtaposition that's been there all along: tribalism, white supremacy, this, that, and the other, that has nothing to do with liberty and justice for all. Because, these folks, and we always make the excuse that it's like, hey, people are living in the four walls of their existence. They've got to go to a job. They can't think about all of these things. Not everybody can know everything, but you have to be an informed citizen to be able to see, when you're going down the path of being destroyed. Now, the media has been so effective for the last 2 decades of covering up all of this information that people don't know what's what. And that's why the Epstein files are so shocking to people, and why they're so relevant, considering this has been over the course of the last 30 years, right? That they're like, oh my God, I can't believe all of these people were really as evil as we thought they might be. And they lie to our face, and they are above the law, and they've got this, protection racket. But what else are they doing? Okay, so what I just demonstrated there, like I told you, is in the multiple trillions. There's 1,000 billion and a trillion. So a lot of people have been trying to further understand Epstein's role in finance and how this all thing worked, because yes, there's the nature of the sex trafficking and you know, obviously predating upon children and pedophilia and all of these sick, disgusting, perverted things. But meanwhile, if you think that's where it begins and ends, you're sadly mistaken. That's just part of their ticket to the club. If you're willing to do those sorts of disgusting behaviors and lie about it, so clearly, you're willing to do anything. And so, have you noticed that all of these people are involved with money? Okay, big time money. So when you extrapolate what happened with Epstein, and I showed this in my first chapter a couple of days ago, I demonstrated this interview with Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein. Well, Jeffrey Epstein, after a question from Steve Bannon, said, "You were in jail during the 2008 great financial crisis, the biggest situation that ever hit our during our lifetimes. And what did you do?" And Epstein just basically said, I made 2 phone calls. I made a phone call to the CEO of Bear Stearns, which was Jimmy Cannon. I made a phone call to the CFO of JP Morgan Chase, which was Jeff Staley, which also in my Truth Bomb Riffs, I did a fantastic interview with David Enrich of the New York Times a while back. And I highly encourage you to watch it. In fact, I think I'll put that in the description as well. But, you know, again, it's 2026, people, all right? We're just now starting to see, and I want to finish that thought on Jeff about Bannon. And so Bannon, at the end of that interview, by the way, and this is floating around on TikTok right now as well, because I identified this the other day, and other people have seen it too, because it's pretty jarring. And it was crystal clear to me that Steve Bannon knew exactly who Jeff Epstein was and what he was involved with, right? And he has this setup question at the end. He's like, "So you're the devil?" And he makes this reference to, you know, how do you get paid, and do you justify providing money from this horrible activity into like science, and that you can justify that. And there was this whole mental gymnastics insanity that does come from narcissists and sociopaths, right? And they just basically expose, and speaking in tongues, what inspired me from the very beginning. For those of you who have seen, you know, these Truth Bomb Riffs, I always said what inspired me from the very beginning was 2 films from the 90s. One was The Usual Suspects, when Kevin Spacey's character said, the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world that he didn't exist, which means deception. You know, multilateral asymmetric information, this, that, and the other, to confuse people so they can't see the forest for the trees, first and foremost. It's a technique. It's also a technique of intelligence, okay? And it works, especially when people are stuck in their lives trying to survive and do what they're due. They're vulnerable, okay? They don't have all the information. And I like to say, when you have the truth, you're bulletproof, because you are. And that's what I'm trying to give and feed tens of millions of you. And further that, back in the 90s, another great film, Denzel Washington in Devil in a Blue Dress playing Ezekiel Rollins, and this really great noir, noir sort of revelation of corruption is the easiest way to discuss it. But he said, you know, I got tired of them pissing on my head telling me it was rain. They must have thought I was some kind of new fool. So in this grand spectrum of what everybody's starting to understand with the Epstein files is that this elite pedo group of sexual racketeers were involved in a much bigger financial juggernaut, is, you know, the gateway to what it is that I'm telling you. And by the way, when Jeffrey Epstein said he called Jimmy Kane of Bear Stearns, and he called Jeff Staley of JP Morgan Chase, and Bannon asked him why, and he's like, well, because I wanted to know what's going to happen to our money. Further, that was revealed this last week or so from Ben Mysalis at Midas Touch, and I'm not sure, I don't have this corroborated, so I can't say that it's actually spot on. He's the only source I've heard this from, but he claims that Epstein was managing Vladimir Putin's money. That's a game changer if that's the case, because for those of you who know the information that I have, and I swear to God, I wanted to do this in 10 minutes, but you can't. Okay, it's an impossibility. So I hope you're following the bouncing ball. But I'm just going to try to set this whole thing up. This is what nobody can express except for me, and nobody's willing to express except for me. Okay, but when Epstein said that, it was clarification for me, and I think confirmation of what another journalist, a guy that I have been involved with, who's done some really, really good work on really trying to paint the picture going back to the 80s of the stuff that was happening with Robert Maxwell, Russia laundered money, and then getting involved with things like Contragate that involved the Saudi, largest arms dealer at the time, Adnan Khashoggi, pardon me. And then obviously he was involved with Epstein, but he was involved with Maxwell. Maxwell was kind of like the protege. Ghislaine Maxwell, that's Robert Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell's his daughter. Epstein shows up with all of this crazy stuff. But the thing that nobody can get to, right? Because it does seem complex and it just seems so overwhelming and it seems like a water cannon, but you got to believe me, this is all what's going on here and why Epstein is the tip of the iceberg. So when Epstein made that revelation, and he confirmed it actually, what he's revealing was in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis, the first thing that happened was there was a meeting between the 13 largest banks in the world and the Secretary of the Treasury, which was Hank Paulson at the time, who came out at Goldman Sachs, and he was the Secretary of the Treasury for the Bush administration. He was deeply, deeply involved with all sorts of, the nature of the whole pipeline of funding through the investment bank, these predatory loans all over the world that ultimately would lead to, God, I'm really going in the weeds here. I don't want to, but I have to. There was this guy named Fabulous Torre, and he was involved with, they were selling crap all over the world to pensions, this, that, and the other, and they knew what they were floating because they were all liars' loans, okay? And so Hank Paulson was the guy making a deal with Tim Geithner, who was the president of the New York Federal Reserve, and they were the guys who were supposed to regulate all of the banks, as well as, I think, behind the scenes, but he wasn't in this meeting at the time, was Ben Bernanke, of course, the Federal Reserve chairman who had replaced Alan Greenspan, who bailed out a year earlier because he knew all of this stuff was coming down the pike, because Alan Greenspan was responsible for enabling all of this stuff to happen. He was what they called the maestro, the head of the Federal Reserve going back to Reagan, and he came out of none other than Lincoln Savings, which was Charles Keating, who was involved with the largest fraud at that time. And so we put one of the biggest fraudsters in charge of the Federal Reserve. What do you think is going to happen? Well, everything that's happened over the course of this time. So when Epstein's talking about how he's going to get his money back, there was this meeting with the 13 banks, with the Secretary of the Treasury, obviously the head of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and they made a deal with these 13 bankers. And this you can cite with Simon Johnson's 13 Bankers, and maybe I'll put a link to that below. But they came up with what was known Maiden Lane. And Hank Paulson had said to all of the CEOs, look, you got one chance to make a deal here, and you're going to sign this 3-page agreement that basically we're going to float you guys. We're going to buy through JP Morgan Chase, the lower stock, because it was collapsing at Bear Stearns. And we're going to try to create we're going to try to stem the systemic meltdown that's taking place because of what was happening from the liars' loans all the way through the derivatives. And ultimately, they made that deal. That was called Maiden Lane. Interestingly enough, Maiden Lane is the street that's right in front of Zuccotti Park, where the Occupy Wall Street movement happened. And that was our first film, Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, of which my partner and my colleague for many years now literally were in the zeitgeist of this whole thing from the very beginning. Okay. And ultimately, I'd always scratch my head about that because, see, that was a precursor, that Maiden Lane initiative, the way they did it, and it's smoke and mirrors and nobody knows who's paying what, but it was basically the Federal Reserve providing liquidity through JP Morgan Chase to backstop what would become this monumental meltdown, right? Because there was all sorts of derivatives and credit default swaps and squared and this, that, and the other that were tangled up in this whole thing that created the $4.5 trillion bubble into a $900 trillion global catastrophe. And so they stemmed the flood and bailed out everybody that was involved with that at JP Morgan Chase and Bear Stearns. And of course, what did Epstein just say to Bannon, right? Yeah, that was the whole thing. And that was the very beginning of what would lead to Federal Reserve Act 13.3 being used illegally to provide what I continue to tell you is the $71 trillion truth. Now, just to put that into perspective, our GDP is about 25 trillion. We're the largest GDP in the world, kind of back and forth, I think, with China at the moment, but it's enormous. And that's the sum total of goods and services produced by the entire country, which is hundreds of millions of people. The $71 trillion that we provided illegally because of the statutes say, and this is all in my work that I've been able to provide you, that I need you to try to wrap your head around, is that the statutes, when it was created in 1933 as a result of what happened in the Great Depression, is they stated in the Glass-Steagall Act that you cannot use the full faith and credit of the United States. This was Federal Reserve Act 13.3, that you can't use the full faith and credit of the United States to provide liquidity to speculation in real estate or any commodities therein, which they were saying was racketeering, because they knew that there was speculation in commodities, which is what blew up the world in quite frankly, what led to the Great Depression. In our work, and I talked about the new Untouchables, when we do the Pecora files, that is in reference to Ferdinand Pecora, who was this incredible lawyer who came out of Tammany Hall, who came from, of all places, Sicily, who didn't understand finance, but he understood fraud. And he got inside the belly of the beast to figure all this stuff out. And that led to the Glass-Steagall Act, that led to the Securities and Exchange Act, that led to the Securities and Exchange Commission to prevent racketeering and all of these things that we're now completely choked by, which has created Trump and everything else. Now, to finish this up, and what I was saying that nobody else will tell you. So we've seen in the news over the course of the last 3 months, really. Letitia James, of course, has this bogus, they pursued her, in this act of retribution, right, based on things that she may have been involved with, because she's now been completely cleared of it. But there's some nuances in terms of if you own a second home and how you do that to get financing on a second house, and you can parlay that. It's basically mortgage fraud is what they were accusing her of, right? Remember, lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. Every accusation is admittance of guilt. This is the entire thing that these guys do every single day. And they're doing right now with Pam Bondi in this hearing in Congress based on Epstein, okay? So that's first and foremost. So there was Letitia James, who's the state AG of New York, and then there was Lisa Cook, who's on the Fed board governor, that they're trying to get fired because they want to get rid of Jerome Powell, because they want to put in this guy who, by the way, was in the Epstein files, right? Because they want to get complete control of the Federal Reserve. Who's they? All of the apparatus of these billionaires that have hijacked the United States and whatever they've got in store for us, including, I think, collapsing the dollar and everything else. So that's part of this. But meanwhile, what I'm trying to tell you, so everybody, in their silos were responding to a long time by Letitia James and Lisa Cook, but they weren't seeing the forest for the trees, right? Because as I just demonstrated with Epstein, there was two other major elements that were involved with financing both Epstein and Donald Trump, and that's Deutsche Bank. Okay. And by the way, I'd happen to mention that I interact with David Enrich, the deputy investigation director for the New York Times, who's actually all over the Epstein stuff at the moment, in 2026. And again, who I interviewed not too long ago. He wrote a book about 4 years ago called Towers of Secrecy, which was the triangulation and the juxtaposition in the relationships between Deutsche Bank, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump. Okay. And quite frankly, all the media didn't fully understand what that was all about. It was about Deutsche Bank's involvement with this global fraud, okay? Which a lot of this was coming out of, and this is a lot of information that I have that I wasn't able to put out in season 2 of The Con, but I'll just mention it right now. And again, this is a water cannon, and I know I'm going to get shit for this, but I don't care. I got to let people know about this. So I had a whistleblower who had this huge convention for many, many, many years in Western Europe. It was called Euronext. And so that would bring together all of the investment banks of Wall Street, all the big money out of Europe and Russia, and they'd come together and they basically put these major deals together, right? And it was a hive network. It was all the major investment banks. It was Morgan Stanley. It was JP Morgan, not JP Morgan, obviously Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, and, who am I? I said Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, among others, okay? Those are the big boys, right? And so they're working with all of these guys, including, as it turns out, Russia, because all the Russian oligarchs are taking all of this money that they're pulling out of Russia, they're throwing it in Western real estate, of which happen to go into subprime liar's loans, which is what I just demonstrated in the Con trailer, which was the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that involved tens of millions of felonies because of liar's loans, which we demonstrate in the Con. That led to season 2 that you saw, all the documentation fabrication. That's part of this whole situation, right? It's a big setup. So the nature and the mechanics of Epstein was involved not just with, of course, Morgan Stanley and Bear Stearns, but also Deutsche Bank. Okay, and Letitia James, by the way, failed to recognize that it was Deutsche Bank that was in on it, as opposed to being the victim of it. And they just chose to do that as a result of not being able to, you know, demonstrate everything that I am for a lot of other reasons that are nefarious as hell. I'll be quite frank with you. That tie back to the Obama administration and everything else. Because the Obama administration and Eric Holder let them get away with this. They all told us, in fact, we showed this in the con, Obama got on 60 Minutes and said, look, what Wall Street did was unethical, but it wasn't illegal. Everything they did was illegal. He just chose not to use the Department of Justice to figure that out. They came up with settlements. They created too big to fail. And they basically let the bad guys get away with it, which was a precursor to everything that we're in the midst of. And oh, yeah, by the way, all of the bad actors that are involved with Epstein are involved with this. Now, further to that point, okay, and this really brings it all full circle to me. So I already mentioned Lisa Cook and Letitia James. Listen, the Supreme Court was in on this as well. So, for example, 3 years ago, there was a case that was brought by the Arkansas Teachers Pension Union and the Pipe Fitters and Steelworkers of America in a class action against Goldman Sachs that basically was suing them for setting them up in these fraudulent loans because they were tying their pensions to all of these liars' loans. Yeah, that's exactly what they did. The Supreme Court predictably said it was an act of God, and so they didn't hold Goldman Sachs accountable. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Because why? The Supreme Court is completely corrupt. But millions of you don't know that. But think about that in terms of those of you on the Bernie side of things and everybody that's talking about the midterms from a standpoint of labor, Robert Reich and everybody else. Yeah, they attacked teachers and plumbers and pipe fitters. Okay, they are the working class. And so they couldn't get justice for stuff. And by the way, I have information, just so you know, that tied all of this together. And this is the biggest eureka of all. Many of you have seen The Big Short, right? You remember in The Big Short that the whole notion was, okay, here's strip dancers that are getting in over their skis by buying more houses that they're worth as kind of a metaphor to this whole thing. And basically, what ultimately happens is that they showed the credit rating agencies as see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, because as The Big Short laid out, and that what the guys who were the hedge fund dudes that were figuring this whole thing out with, of course, the main guy from Deutsche Bank, which was played by, you know, Ryan Gosling brilliantly, by the way, one of the greatest performances ever. And by the way, I love the movie and I thought it was great. But what Adam McKay and Brad Pitt and Christian Bale and all of the rest that were involved with The Big Short emulated was that they got to the last 5 minutes of the film where Steve Carell, the character that was the hedge fund manager that got in on all this information, that realized the whole thing was a fraud, that, you know, in the last 5 minutes, they said that, you know, oh yeah, and the Justice Department would then pull all of this information together, and then we would have, you know, indictments and convictions, and then everything would be right again, right? Because that's the way the system of the United States justice works, right? But then they go, no, that didn't happen. What I'm telling you is I'm filling in the blanks of why it didn't happen with all of the real information that they never got to. And by the way, they got it wrong on the strip dancers. But going back to this whole thing with the Supreme Court, so as it relates to labor and everything else, as it relates to the Federal Reserve. So with Maiden Lane, the Federal Reserve illegally enabled Wall Street to get floated tens of trillions of dollars for this mammoth racketeering predation scheme, okay, based on what we call liar's loans. And the way the United States government works is that Congress is the power of the purse. Congress are the ones that are supposed to be able to sort out what happens to be able to demonstrate to the American people, because they got to be accountable to the American people, that, you know, we're going to spend X amount of money to be able to stabilize the economy, and then we're going to take care of business. None of that happened. And what I mean by take care of business is to expose all this stuff, take the bad guys down, have them go to jail, take back their ill-gotten gains, and then reset the system. We didn't do that. We let the bad guys get away with it, which has led to this moment that we're in, even though we're all now really super, you know, engaged with Epstein. And, you know, further to that point, by targeting, obviously, the working class, the highest court in the land basically bent over backwards to be involved with corruption. And I'm telling you, I've got all of the information, and this is the other aspect that I wanted to relate to. John Paulson, the hedge fund manager, is the real guy. Okay, so in the Big Short, they basically, Christian Bale's character is the legendary trader whose name eludes me at the moment. It'll probably come to me in a second. But, Christian Bale is playing the drums, and because they're doing all the math and they figure out what's going on with the appraisal fraud and everything else, and they know it's going to blow, so they bet against it. And the guy's on his edge of the seat because all of his, investors are like, dude, you're leading us down this road to to death, right? You're going to lose all of our money. But meanwhile, he knew it was going to blow, and that's why he shorted. It's a big risk. It's a way that the gambling casino works. And God, I'm hung up on the name. If you think of the name and you want to put it down in the description below, I could look it up right now, but I don't want to deviate from this. But ultimately, to put it in perspective, The Big Short that was parried by the book, which was Michael Lewis, and then ultimately picked up by Plan B and then made into the movie, they ultimately made, I'm going to say, $500 million on the trade. Okay. With all that drama and everything that plays out in The Big Short and all of the introspection and the clarity and the big, prolific, profound questions and everything else, there was $500 million that they demonstrated. Okay. John Paulson, not to be confused with Hank Paulson, but John Paulson, he and his lieutenant Paolo Pellegrini, they had a hedge fund. They got inside information. They started, and I've got this straight from the Wall Street Journal, and we've got all of the evidence of this. They knew the liar's loans were going to blow. They knew exactly how these were matriculating all over the country. So they went and they hired literally felons in Jacksonville, Florida, probably all over Florida, but then in Seattle, Washington. And they had these two major vectors where they were getting and loading into these securities, these liar's loans from all around the world and the country, quite frankly, in this massive bubble. And then they started betting against it on behalf of Goldman Sachs. Okay. So in The Big Short, they barely touched that, but that's really what was going on. Goldman Sachs was the investment bank that was parlaying this to all of its investors all over the world based on liar's loans because they knew it was all bullshit. And then it was Goldman Sachs that knew that Bear Stearns, all of their collateral was shit in the overnight repo lending world. So they bet against it. And that's what created the run in 2008 that blew up the world, of which they profited immeasurably. This guy, John Paulson, in comparison to Michael Burry was his name. I knew it would come to me. They made 500 million on their short. John Paulson and Pellegrini made 20 billion. According to Greg Zuckerman of the Wall Street Journal, they backed up the Brinks truck. Okay. So this whole thing is insane, right? It's just insane. But again, tying it back, it was Bear Stearns, JP Morgan Chase, Maiden Lane, and now John Paulson profiting from it. And then it goes to the Supreme Court that covers it up. Okay. That destroys the working class and everybody else in this massive deception racket that is predation. Same elements that are involved psychologically with what we're seeing in all of the Epstein scenario, but just on a grander scale, okay? And so John Paulson gets away with it. Right before the election, Trump was, considering Paulson as his Secretary of Treasury, which would really be no crazier situation than this guy Scott Benson, or before that Steve Mnuchin, because all of these guys have been involved with this, and they're the same characters of this guy like Howard Lutnick, who said, I would never step another foot inside of Jeffrey Epstein's house, even though I lived next door to him for 15 years. And oh, by the way, yeah, I take my yacht after he was arrested for raping children. And then, I took my family to his island, for example. He just lies to our face, like they all do, because they don't think, because they're pissing on your head, telling you what's right, because they know you can't put this together. Because it's hard to put all this stuff together in your head because it's mental gymnastics. But it took us years and years and years and thousands of hours and millions of dollars to put this together. But I can assure you, we didn't have tens of thousands of employees and $90 billion a year a budget to put this together. But we did rely on the people that were in the system, the whistleblowers and the folks at the DOJ and the FBI and the SEC and all that stuff, to put together what the DOJ didn't do on behalf of the American people. That's who I am, again, with the $71 trillion truth. That's what we did. So I've tied together Letitia James, Lisa Cook, John Paulson, the Supreme Court, Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump, Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan Chase, and I'm not sure if there's anybody that I wanted to touch upon that I'm missing, but that's the whole thing. It's still the whole thing, because all of this money was coming from around the world. Literally, my colleague and I learned this at the very beginning of our journey. They were, first of all, calling it moral hazard because of what happened with the government bailing out bad actors to basically float criminality. That's the polite word on Wall Street is moral hazard. I call it socialism for criminal billionaires. What do you call it? But beyond that, we also learned that at that time, everybody was saying there was $70 trillion around the world looking for a place to park its capital. The safest place were mortgage-backed securities. And oh yeah, as it appears that Epstein just laid out, hey, he's calling for, where's my money? I'm in jail for raping a child, but I can call the CEO of Bear Stearns and the CFO of JP Morgan Chase, and they'll return they'll take my phone calls. And again, that's where ultimately Bannon says, well, are you the devil? And he goes on from there, and I demonstrated that the other day. So keep that in mind. All of these types of things that I'm saying as I introduce you to the last piece of this Chapter 3 introduction to the Clean New Deal, right? And don't forget, I said yesterday that Donald Trump's administration through Russell Vogt, who, by the way, came up working for Phil Gramm, and Phil Gramm was on the chair of the Senate Banking and Finance Committee, and was a powerful senator from Texas. And he and his wife, Wendy Lee Graham, put the death knell into regulation. They created deregulation, desupervision, decriminalization during the Clinton administration, by the way, which was obviously happening during all of this Epstein madness as well. And ultimately, you had all of this foreign capital that was rolling into the United States based on predation, while the elites are all raping children, right? And I don't know if I can say that word because of the nature of the algorithm, but you know what they were involved with. And they were the first ones that were bailed out. And they doubled down and they tripled down and they quadrupled down. And we've been dealing with this ever since, because the first time the full faith and credit of the United States has been used for racketeering because they could do a workaround from Congress being the power of the purse. How did they do that? They hired idiots like like Marjorie Taylor Greene, where they could pay $4 million a year to not ask no questions and do all of this idiocracy that now she's running away from, that enabled all this stuff. This is a continuum that never ended. Why? Because that's where the money is. That's where the power is. That's where the control is. That's why the elites can be above the law to destroy everything that matters, including science, equality, technology, progress, sustainability, beauty, all of the things that matter in this world. So I'm going to finish up with this, and thanks for tuning in. I really hope some people will react and say that they could follow along, and they're going to like, subscribe, and share, because this is the biggest information in the world. Everything that I just laid out to you, if you go up on the cleannewdeal.org or Patrick Lovell Presents the Clean New Deal, and you click on the white paper and you go to Federal Reserve Act 13.3, it's all there. Every single thing that the New York Times and the Washington Post and everybody else, and don't forget Jeff Bezos, the billionaire, just laid off 300 journalists from the Washington Post who never got this information, did they? Right? We're still, by the way, people started getting at the Washington Post because, Jamal Khashoggi worked at the Washington Post. Like, oh my God, it's Salman, what's his name? Mohammed bin Salman, basically chopped him up into a million pieces. That was the news, right? Let's not think about 9/11. Let's just, let's focus on one guy, not to mention, I think that says a lot. But look, the detailed look at the Fed's bailout by funding facility, the illegal actions of the Federal Reserve. The most important thing is the third cell down below, the interview with Rajan Cohen of Sullivan and Cromwell, who was the firm that created the CIA. They were the guys that were there to pick up the pieces. And ultimately, he says everything that I'm telling you. Okay? So if you're a journalist and you want to know what everybody's been hiding for now the last 14 years, and why Patrick Lovell is the deliverer of the $71 trillion truth that makes all of this possible, all of the information is here. And as you can see, a lot more. And it's to me, it's at this stage of the game, it's easy. It's not rocket science, it's racketeering, but it does require your time to be able to shut down all the lies, stop buying lies, and to get down with the truth, because this is a revolution of truth, which is, again, going back to the beginning, it's the Clean New Deal, right? So the precepts of the Clean New Deal, I'm just going to introduce, and I'll move through quickly because this is way longer than I wanted to do. But we had murders by ICE in Minneapolis right before our eyes that the Trump administration is gaslighting us about regarding Renee Nicole Good. We all saw all of the different, footage, not to mention Alex Preddy. And of course, there's got to be an investigation. We all saw it. How long would it take an investigation to basically, what are they going to investigate? Like whatever they want to bring in to cherry pick to be able to try to damn, the victims, blame the victims. And that's what this whole thing has been about the whole time. Now, how does all that happen? Well, because SCOTUS is the heart of the corruption. Well, they're the ones who ultimately gave their premature of the highest court in the land and what the entire world basically had, based itself on, at least in democratic countries around the world, that we got it right, right? We had learned, knowledgeable people in separation of powers to this incredible ecosystem that was set up, that we're going to celebrate 250-year anniversary of the American Revolution that created obviously the Bill of Rights and ultimately the Constitution, so that we'd have separation of powers, so that we wouldn't do what every other country in the history of the world has done, where absolute power corrupts absolutely. But ultimately, they literally have a backdoor. If you look at Alex Gibney's work on dark money that was built on Jane Moyer's book of the same name, there's literally a backdoor at the Supreme Court where all of these deals were made, where over $1 billion had been, moved through all sorts of things to create the situation where we'd get the executive presidency, otherwise known as the king, right? Of the dumbest, most idiotic moron in the hit transactional freak that lies to our face every other day. I emphasized this yesterday. Trump, I believe, among other, his guffaws, included, saying that 300 million people Americans were murdered by drug cartels. Okay, there's 300, maybe 40 million Americans. Yeah, I don't think that's a possibility. I'm being facetious, right? He also said that communism has been around for 2,000 years. I don't even want to address that, but that's the guy. And if you look here at the picture that we put in, I mean, it's like literally the emperor's new clothes on really bad acid, right? Do your eyes deceive you? Do your lying eyes deceive you? Everything that this guy has done since coming into a power. Think about what happened yesterday with Mark Kelly and all of the other patriots that served in the military, that serve in the Senate and Congress, that sent the message to the military that you do not accept illegal orders from really what this president is. What exactly? He got out of 5, bone deferments, where he was a coward who didn't serve in Vietnam. He's told our service members that they're cowards and losers, this and that and the other. He used to mock John McCain for being in prison in the Hanoi Hilton for however many years. I think it was 3 to 5 years, having, been tortured and everything else. And this guy who's living in his penthouse because he inherited money from Fred, Trump, and basically starts lying and working with the mob the whole time. And he's just got this big fat mouth, like his gross body suggests. And this guy is flying around on Air Force One, got a $400 million jet from Saudi Arabia, already got over $1.4 billion, according to the New York Times. And we're like freaking out about, what's her name? Savannah Guthrie's mom, which was news last night. And I hope they find her alive and well. And I think that would be great. But compared to what? All of the stuff we're dealing with, Doge and 600,000 children being died around the world because of U.S. Rug pulling USAID, or how about millions and millions and millions of pieces of data within Social Security because of big balls and Elon Musk and what's happening with Peter Thiel and everything else. My God, people! And so we show what about the Electoral College? You remember I mentioned about documentation fabrication? How many of you are aware? Show your hands or show it in the comment section below. Knew that Donald Trump used a fake elector slate to create forgeries to try to steal the election in swing states in 2020. And by the way, he wasn't the first person to do that. I learned that through Rachel Maddow's, Project Ultra, I think it was. Yeah, it turns out that, of course, Senator McCarthy, when he ran for president, tried to do the same thing. All of this is a continuation. All of this is stuff that Steve Bannon knew. This was kind of the core of how these guys started to develop through John Birch Society, which was created by Fred Koch, and then ultimately has evolved into this whole thing, which is this authoritarian hijacking of the United States, whereas we all know right now they're building warehouse camps and they're trying to buy real estate all over the United States as well as Canada to basically create concentration camps, the gulags. This is Russia in 1998 through now. Okay, that's what's going on. That's their parallel. And then they're getting, how are they getting away with it? Because they got tens of trillions of dollars illegally for free, right? And then they bought government and they bought the Supreme Court. It's just a massive hijacking. And we had 30 years of this type of stuff in mergers and acquisitions on Wall Street in terms of corporate rating. That's what they've been doing since the 80s, okay? Once you understand the right questions of perversity, then you understand we're not a democracy, we're not a capitalist system. What we are is a lie. We're a complete and utter lie, and this is a revolution of truth. And when you put it all together, you have the Rubik's Cube to where, like my colleague Roseanne Rabiolo says, when you drink from the fountain of truth, how does she say it? When you have the truth, it's like you drink from the fountain of youth. And she's 76 years old and she feels like a kid because she's so stimulated to be able to get this information to everybody. Because as dark and as menacing and as horrible as everything is that is going on, this is the greatest opportunity in the history of the last 40 years and our lifetime to get rid of the evil, to turn the tables on this madness, and to create a revolution of truth that purges the misery of tyranny and unleashes the renaissance of possibility. Why? Well, first and foremost, if you look at the first precept, we got to recreate a modern day Glass-Steagall to separate commercial banking from investment banking, first and foremost to align interests, but that also allows us to be able to hold the bad guys to account when they break the law without having systemic risk. But we already learned these lessons after the Great Depression. But here's the caveat. Everything that I've told you so far lends itself to this understanding that because the Federal Reserve literally became the power of the purse over Congress because nobody understands how the system is supposed to work, and we already have the statutes, and I'll go up against any economist, any legal expert in this world and demonstrate to you, because I've already showed you where it is, what they actually did and what the statute said. You cannot use the full faith and credit of the United States to basically provide exigent lending to commodities trading, especially in real estate. All of that's laid out in the statutes of Federal Reserve Act 13.3. However, nobody considered global racketeering. I guess they didn't think that big, even though they were doing almost the exact same thing before the Great Depression. So this is all about stemming global racketeering and predation, which is everything Epstein on to what I'm telling you, based on everything that I've laid out in this. And I could give you so much more specificity, but we have got to recreate the statute, and everybody has to come to Jesus moment on this, including the Democrats that were involved. There's no way we can go forward if we don't have a mea culpa from Democrats. And if they don't say this, they're liars and they're covering this up. And that's been part of the whole thing. And that's why I'm the producer with the $71 trillion truth. You cannot allow the full faith and credit of the United States to be used to float a financial system that's based in racketeering. Meanwhile, and this was another truth bomb that we did recently, where we just exposed that $76 billion has been unleashed illegally by the Federal Reserve to JP Morgan Chase to basically backstop trades in silver. I think I don't want to go down the whole mechanics of it, but very similar to the London whale, if you guys knew what happened in 2012. So it's never ending. And by the way, the $71 trillion truth that I'm revealing to you, it started, monumentally during Obama, and that the whole thing was the cover up, and that's what gave us Trump. But it was $33 trillion in 2009. We did another 16 trillion in quantitative easing. Then we did another 22 trillion to back a repo run in 2022. That's 71 trillion. That's on the low end, okay? But it also went further. So you've got the Obama administration, you've got the Trump administration, the first version, and then you've got what happened during Biden, where Biden enabled the same activity to backstop Silicon Valley Bank and New Republic on runs based on crypto, and then ultimately on interest rate swaps, and then ultimately Peter Thiel, because he had all of his money at Silicon Valley Bank, which is, of course, all of the things that are Palantir and all of the other things that are being demonstrated in the Epstein files, okay? So it's insane. The flip side of that is you've got to create, we got to upend Citizens United. You hear it from Bernie Sanders, you hear it from AOC. Yeah, dark money funding in the shadows is what leads to the lying and the asymmetric information and the absolute corruption that the Supreme Court, who basically buried the working class, legalized. So what's that tell you? Tyranny. It's all tyranny, right? That's what we had a revolution against in King George III and the East India Trading Company and the West, the Royal Navy, and of course the Redcoats and the power mechanisms that could create, all of the apparatus of imperialism. And that's what we've become. Shame on us. Are you kidding me? You got to live true to what you put on paper, like the great Reverend Martin Luther King said. And that's what we're doing in the civil rights, peaceful like movement to recreate, a mission for people running for office for the truth. because the Democrats aren't going to do this. And more importantly, everybody's going to ask in their own sequestered spaces, well, how are we going to pay for that, right? I've demonstrated to you, if you look at precept number 3, we've already provided $71 trillion to a very tiny, tiny percentage of the American population. That's led to this disparity of wealth that's just absolutely enormous, because we provided not 71 trillion to 300 million people. That was literally to maybe 300,000 people, of which the top 0.1% of those constitute Elon Musk and all of the top guys that you see in the Forbes 500 list all the time, including guys like Larry Ellison, who is now, involved with this, this propaganda situation to further take what private equity and hedge funds have done to media for the whole time. So you can't get the truth. And again, the only way that people are going to get the truth, and if the light breaks through the darkness, is if you become a nuclear reaction vector to everything I'm telling you. But ultimately, if your issue is Medicare for all, if your issue is getting rid of systemic racism in prison, if your issue is renewable energy, where are we going to get the money? That's not the right question. The question is, why are we spending tens of trillions of dollars on people that are literally predating upon us in the Epstein class? Okay, that's the question. You've got to wrap your head around that. How do you retool the system? Well, with professionals. If you get on a 747, do you want somebody who's trained, that's been licensed to be able to fly you, or do you want a bunch of trunks that are in the bar that you see before you get on? That might be the Trump cabinet, for example. Yeah, it's a stupid question, right? But what world are we living in? Okay, that's the world we're living in. That's how stupid this is. So you got to understand that there's nothing that we can't create in the productive capacity. And yeah, you do have to have a sense of macroeconomics and money supply and inflation, how those things work. But trust me, we have a lot of smart people in this country that can regulate that stuff in the right way. But regulate is the key consideration. What all of this is just basically unshackling the regulations we learned after the Great Depression to create this illegal lawlessness that now is destroying us and turning us into an authoritarian state. There's no way, I know millions of you will not tolerate that if you know the truth. And what do I mean by not tolerate? I mean tens of millions of us getting active with the truth, to go blare the truth, to punch through the hole of lies so that everybody knows what's going on. And so then we become organized, more organized than the billionaire class, to basically create this revolution of lies for people that are stupid. This has to be a revolution of truth from people who are smart. Get it? Are you those people? If you've lasted this long, I guarantee you are. Further down the mix here, 4, 5, 6, 7, and we missed one in there, but I'll just lay it out to you. We got to end judicial or qualified immunity, and judicial immunity, and presidential immunity, and then of course in the electoral college. All of those things are going to have to take place as we get people in Congress who represent the American people on behalf of the American people to basically reboot the American dream, because that's how we got to do it. And you got to identify the truth. You can't speak in platitudes. You can't speak in silos. You can't focus on Donald Trump as the only thing that we have to replace here. Okay. Donald Trump is a mastermind of nothing. He never created this situation. He played ball in the arena, and then he just was transactional. Okay. It was all of the guys who are technocrats, who are smart, that are paid by the billionaires, that sorted all this stuff out. And they've done it over the course of decades. We, the people, have failed, right? Because too many of us are too busy on our phones. We have no idea how the systems work. We don't have an education. We don't even know how laws get made. We don't even know how many representatives that we have and what they do and how they do it and everything else. I'm not talking to those people. I'm talking to the 3.5% of the people that have to galvanize. And I'm really looking for scientists, architects, engineers, entrepreneurs, people who understand systems, who are leaders, that aren't part of the top 0.01%. Okay. Because they're going to destroy us all. The whole thing is they're going to just collapse the economy. And if you don't think you're going to be swept up in it, ask the scientist who just got all of his funding destroyed by the Trump administration pulling all of the subsidies that were happening during Biden for offshore wind research and everything else, that ultimately destroyed regulation for all environmental regulation. You can't be that stupid to not understand that you are a target as well if you haven't already fallen through the cracks. Join us, get involved, because if we all together reflexively press this thing forward, then of course we are going to be able to build a new United States that is meant to be the United States in order to form a perfect union. The 250 years of fighting tyranny, and then fascism, and then obviously the Confederate States, and through the civil rights, everything this country has done has been this kind of back and forth mosh pit. But you know who you are in the matrix here. Finally, we've got to institute term limits for U.S. senators and representatives, and we've got to prohibit all insider trading. Like I referenced before, Marjorie Taylor Greene came in as an idiot, CrossFit, bloviating, Mr. Ed fool that now some people in Democratic media want to say is a hero because she's now like not MAGA because of all things Epstein files, but she's somewhat quiet. Guys, don't miss the plot here. She's walked with literally $27 million for 6 years of service. Okay. That's an extraordinary amount of money that nobody knows where the money came from, how it did. And she's like, yeah, I've been there, done that. Fuck, I'm out of this place, man. Maybe Marjorie's a lot smarter than I give her credit for, given how, I'm not worth $27 million, but I wouldn't sell my soul to the devil in a Faustian bargain either, because that's who Patrick Lovell is. I'm the guy with the $71 trillion truth. I went way longer than I wanted to. But if you, me, and everybody you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in equality and dignity and decency and integrity and sustainability and beauty, when we merge in unity behind what's behind me, the Clean New Deal, will bulldoze the misery of tyranny to unleash the renaissance of possibility. When you become a nuclear reaction vector, the Big Bang of truth that we're dropping, force light into darkness. Thank you, my friends. Thank you for hearing me out. And I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.